Welcome back, everyone. Hope you got a small break from the screen time, and now we move on to our next session by Dr. Sunaina Singh. Sunaina is a freelance academic editor and consultant academic trainer with Editage. Sunaina will tell us about the best practices of responding to the editors and reviewers of a journal, and subsequently we'll talk about research ethics. Sunaina has got 9 years of experience of working as freelance academic editor. She works closely with researchers and students to refine their research manuscripts and help them communicate their findings effectively. I welcome you, Sunaina. Over to you.
For that introduction, and thank you, Malti, for a very interesting and insightful session. And I welcome all the participants to the second leg of today's session. So without wasting any time, I'm going to just get right into it. So first, I'm going to be talking about the peer review process. So Malti explained to you how to write and communicate your findings effectively. But a very important part of the scientific communication process is peer review. And a lot of young researchers, those who are new to the process, they get daunted by this process. They want to learn more about it. So I'm going to be breezing through that rather quickly and then move on to the main focus of my talk, which is about avoiding retractions and publishing ethically. So first, I'm going to be talking about responding to peer review comments. Now, what is peer review and why is it important? It functions as a sort of a quality control system. It's like a gatekeeping mechanism where experts in the field will assess your study for novelty, whether it has any merit, whether there are any glaring issues, etc. We all are faced with a lot of fake news and fake data, and you don't know what to believe. So there needs to be some kind of control mechanism. So hence peer review. What does the process look like? So you have prepared your article. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah. So you submit your article to the journal, and the next step is that the journal editor will assess your article and either reject it because it's not good enough or the scope doesn't match. So that is called a desk rejection. If it clears that, it then moves on to the next process. It goes to the peer reviewers who are experts in the field. They give their feedback. The manuscript is sent back to the journal editor, and then the journal editor decides again whether it should be rejected again or sent back to the authors for modifications. Now, this process could go on a couple of times. The cycle could be repeated, editor back to the author, back to the peer reviewers, back and forth. It could happen. And even at the end of all this, the paper could get rejected. It's all part of the scientific process. It's all part of the game. It is nothing to be depressed about. And I'm going to tell you why. So this is the kind of decisions that journal editors will give. It is almost, they jokingly say, as rare as seeing a unicorn for your manuscript to be accepted immediately. But most often, you are going to be asked to make certain kind of revisions, minor revisions or major revisions. There could also be something called a reject with review or complete reject without review, which was desk rejection, what I spoke about. So why do I say that it is nothing to be sad about? Because the comments that you get from these peer reviewers are only going to strengthen your manuscript. Please remember, it is not any kind of personal attack on you or your work. It is something to improve your study. So I'm going to quickly tell you about how do you go about responding to these comments. So I like to call it the calm method because actually that goes a long way. So researchers will get their comments from the peer reviewers, and the first thing is to feel very upset because most likely there will be criticism of your work, and people tend to take it personally, and they immediately start writing out their responses very angrily or sadly. Please avoid doing that. Take time, sleep over it, look at those comments the next day, go through them several times, discuss it with your co-authors, and then begin answering. Do it in a very systematic way. And when everything is done, when you answer all the comments, all the questions, you make the necessary changes to your manuscript, then your resubmission package would include your cover letter, the list of responses all arranged in a systematic way, your manuscript with the track changes or highlighted changes, and then a version with, the clean version without the track changes. So if you provide all these elements neatly and nicely, it just makes the process easier. So just some FAQs, a lot of people tend to ask me, what if I cannot address a reviewer's suggestion? It could happen, it's very common. For example, the reviewer asks you to add something which now it's too late. That moment has passed. You can't get an image of that particular element or whatever. If you are absolutely unable to address the situation, be honest in your response and mention that you agree with the response. The tip is to always be very polite. Try to agree with the reviewer mostly, and then say that, you cannot provide that, but is there any alternative? If you could not capture a picture of that, could you provide a diagram instead or something like that, just as an example. Another very common question I get is, there are two reviewers and both have given absolutely conflicting comments. How do I address that? So this is a very favorite picture of mine. You can't make out whether it says turn left or turn right. So it is very possible for two reviewers to have diametrically opposite views. In that case, don't get worried. Try to identify the reviewer you associate with most closely, as in not the reviewer, but the response. So who do you agree with more? You stick to that. And to the other reviewer, you justify why you don't agree with that reviewer. You are not a referee. You don't need to get them both on the same page. You have the final say. If there is any further issue, it's the journal editor who will then intervene. So in short, the peer review process is very important. It offers a very good opportunity to improve the quality of your manuscript. It increases the chances of acceptance. And if your paper is rejected by a journal and you have got comments, don't go ahead and submit it to another journal without addressing those comments, because it'll just, it's a waste then. Try to address those issues and then resubmit to a different journal. Moving on to the next session, avoid retractions, publish ethically. So Isaac Newton once said, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, giants being previous researchers. However, it's really unfortunate if sometimes those giants you are looking up to are actually, their work has been a pillar of lies. Unfortunately, research misconduct is more common than you would believe. It is widespread. It is not country specific. I'm going to be telling you a lot of stories, so it will just make the session more interesting, but it is actually a very grim picture that I'm going to be painting. So starting in 1973, I picked up this example because a lot of you are animal researchers. Now, Dr. Summerlin was a veterinary researcher. He claimed that he had developed this ability to transfer skin cells from black mice onto white mice, and then those white mice would grow these black patches. Actually, that never happened. The patches were gray, they weren't really black. But when he had to show it to his supervisor, he actually colored those patches with a marker pen black. Thankfully, he was caught by a lab attendant who happened to, put some alcohol or water or something on the mice, and he saw that the color just came off. Then another example is of Huang Woo-suk. He is very famously known to be the first person to have cloned the dog Snuppy. That work of his, of course, was flawless. But later on, He claimed to have cloned human embryos and developed certain stem cells, patient-specific stem cells, and he got these great publications in Nature. But later on, it was found out that all those findings were fabricated. It was a complete lie. A third very famous story is the STAP cells, stimulus-triggered acquisition of pluripotency. So this young researcher in Japan claimed to have been able to trigger pluripotency in normal cells by applying stress. And again, she won these amazing publications in very, very high-ranking journals. But shortly later, it was found that a lot of her data, most of it was fabricated. And to this day, nobody has been able to reproduce those findings. Those cells have never been created again. And the very sad outcome of this particular instance is that a senior researcher who was associated with her and who had nothing to do with the misconduct ended up committing suicide, Dr. Sasai. So misconduct has very, very far-reaching implications. It's very interesting that if you anonymously ask researchers, and this was done recently, 2% of scientists actually admitted to falsifying data, at least once in their careers. About 14% had witnessed others doing so. So I'd like you to ask yourselves, if you are active in research, have you ever been guilty of doing that? Ask yourselves. And at the end of this session, I want you to really, really think about it. You can run, but you can't hide. I repeat, you can run, but you can't hide. So while it's very easy to fabricate data, fabricate your, images and all, it is equally easy to get caught, and people are getting caught. There are these people who have scientists who have taken it upon themselves to look into these studies and highlight grave cases of misconduct. So there are a couple of blogs that I follow, and I would recommend that you also have a look. There's Retraction Watch, For Better Science, and Science Integrity Digest. Retraction Watch actually has a leaderboard with the top researchers with the highest number of retractions. Topping that is a Japanese scientist with 183 retractions. Another interesting point to note is of the top 33, all except one are men. Many are Asian, many are Indians. So it's a very, very worrying trend. Very, very relevant in today's times. Papers on COVID-19 are also being retracted at a worrying rate. And that is just very, very alarming. As recently as 2 days ago, 31 papers on COVID. So that is within the short span of 5 or 6 months, papers have been retracted. Now, why, you would ask, should retractions be published? Now, when you get a publication, when your paper is published, you will go around telling everyone. You will announce it to the world. You will put it on social media. My paper has got published. But if a paper is retracted, you are not going to be telling the world. It's a matter of shame, right? So which is why it is very important for it to be put up and publicized, because researchers who are not aware of the retraction might continue to cite those papers. Now coming to what is research integrity and what is misconduct. It's a no-brainer. Research integrity is the responsible conduct of research. You have the responsibility of being a good researcher. So any breach in the standards of honesty and integrity and ethics, any breach in that is considered misconduct. So that includes fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting your results. So why is misconduct harmful? A couple of examples. Very, very recent. I'm sure you all have heard of what happened about the HCQ studies that were retracted from well-known journals. Now, based on those studies, when they were published, the WHO and a lot of governments actually changed their policies because of those studies. And now those studies have gone and got retracted. There was a bone researcher, Sato. Up to 60 of his studies have been retracted. But as a result, a lot of studies and treatment protocols that were based on his studies are now, they stand on nothing. A favorite example of mine is this false linkage by a doctor called Andrew Wakefield. He claimed that the MMR vaccine was linked to autism. It was completely based on false data. But as a result, what has happened? There has been a resurgence in measles in certain countries, and it has given rise to this lobby of people who believe that vaccination is wrong, vaccination is bad for our children, and it has such far-reaching implications. So this ripple effect, one retracted study or just a couple of studies, the reach is very wide and it spans over years sometimes. At a more personal level, how does research misconduct affect a researcher? It could lead to loss of funding, loss of employment, legal actions, psychological distress, your reputation is tainted, and it just has an effect on the scientific progress. Now, the top reasons for retractions and misconduct, up to 40% are because of what is known as honest error. You are not even aware that you are committing fraud. So, which is why it is very important to attend such sessions to educate yourself about what comprises misconduct. So, at least that 40% can be ruled out. And willful misconduct is, of course, extremely dangerous and wrong. And unclear is where you are not able to determine whether the researcher knew whether he or she was accidentally committed those fraud or was willfully aware. So now coming to the matters related to integrity and ethics, I'm going to go over these 5 points in great detail. First is the type of research objectives. So there could be ethical, cultural, or institutional restrictions. Some of these objectives could vary across countries. There are certain topics that are proscribed, like human cloning, bioterrorism. So research on these topics are considered unethical depending on the country that you are in. So as an example, there was a Chinese scientist 2 years ago claimed to have used CRISPR-Cas9 for genome editing of babies. But owing to the unethical nature of the research, he was indicted. The work was never published, and WHO ended up launching a 5-year moratorium on gene editing of humans. Coming to research material. So most of you work on animals, say endangered species with just very few surviving individuals, or the kind of species you are working on, the size, whether they are highly sentient or not so much. All these aspects need prior permissions and approvals. Material obtained without knowledge or consent, any kind of commercial material for testing, if there are conflicts of interest, all these aspects need to be considered. Objectionable methods. So how are you treating the experimental animals? Are you following the protocols or are you tweaking them? Testing of drugs or things without people's knowledge. Biased sampling, very, very common. Again, it happens unknowingly because people are not aware of what is right or wrong during the statistical analysis. Coming back to Juan Wusuk's fabrication of data, and also the methods that he used were unethical. So fabrication was that none of the cells that he claimed were cloned, they did not match the donors. It was a complete false claim that he had created pluripotent ESCs through SCNT. He had actually done it through IVF. And the way he had sourced the human eggs was also highly, highly unethical. Coming to objectionable ways of reporting results. So touching up your images in a way that's not acceptable, fabricating your data, not reporting inconvenient results. There is something known as p-hacking. I'm going to come to that in a bit. And making false claims or overstating results. So even Malti spoke of this, where you have some sort of finding, but you try to exaggerate it or overstate it. That is considered unethical, or you're trying to hype up your findings. Again, coming back to Obokata and the STAP cell saga, the premise of the study itself was wrong. She had misinterpreted the findings. Some green fluorescence that she found, she completely misinterpreted it because it was actually an artifact. The actual methods that she used were misrepresented. The data was false and fabricated. Till now, as I mentioned earlier, that whole method has not been validated. And the retractions are still ongoing. The latest paper to be retracted from that study group happened this year. Okay, quick question. So you have not set the sample size of your study, and you decide to continue collecting and testing data till you reach your value of significance. Is this correct? Do you think this approach is right? Okay, I'm not getting any answers yet. So yes, correct. It is not right. Correct, it is not right. So this is known as data dredging or p-hacking or data fishing. So these are the ways where you can go wrong. So please pay attention. So a lot of researchers, what they'll do is they will record many response variables and then pick and choose which to report after analysis. That is wrong. Then deciding whether to include or drop outliers after the analysis. Wrong. Excluding, combining, splitting treatment groups after analysis. Wrong. Excluding or including, again, making any changes to the data or your decisions after the analysis. So you have set a sample size and you suddenly stop your data exploration once you reach your p-value. You're scared. If I collect any more data, I might lose that significant value. This is completely wrong. We are trying to chase this significant findings, but that is not the way science works. Even if you find something that negates the hypothesis you started with, that is also a finding. So please don't be afraid of that. Coming to the last point, which is further subdivided into 9 points, ethics in methods, reporting, and publishing. Some of it is overlapping with what I've already spoken about, but some of these I know a lot of students ask about, particularly salami slicing and plagiarism. So I know there's going to be a lot of attention for those sections, but please pay attention to the rest of the topics also. Each of them are very, very important. Very relevant to all of you, but also I'm guessing you would be aware, ethics of conducting animal research. If you are working with animals, I'm sure you would have heard of the ARRIVE guidelines. So that is animal research reporting of in vivo experiments. So in case you haven't, please go to their website and visit their guidelines. Then every country has their specific, body that gives their own guidelines. So for India, it is the CPCSEA. And again, visit their website. They have very, very detailed information on guidelines to follow. In a nutshell, it's important that you follow the guidelines of your country's regulatory body when creating your study proposal. Always get the required approval before conducting the study on the animals. And very, very important are the 3 R's: replacement, reduction, refinement. So replacement is if you can replace your animal models with something like a computer simulation or in vitro tissue culture based approaches, please try that. Another aspect of replacement would be, can you replace a larger mammal with a smaller one, or something that is lower on the phylogenetic scale, lower sentient beings like insects or zebrafish or worms, etc. Reduction would be a reduction in the number of animals while still being statistically significant. Refinement would be refining your techniques in such a way that suffering is minimized. So question, this is a mouse with a tumor. And I mean, tumor biologists would be using mice as models. But what strikes you when you see this particular mouse? Anybody? Is it usual? Is it unusual? So I'll go ahead and answer. These sizes, no, hairless is not a problem. There are hairless mice also, but the tumor is very, very high. Correct, yes, the tumor burden is too high. So there are guidelines for acceptable maximum tumor size. So according to most guidelines, for mice, it is 20 millimeters diameter and 40 millimeters for a rat. Yes. So it's just think of the animal. I mean, it's just imagine a human with such a large tumor. So please, if you are working in the field, check what level of tumor burden is acceptable. Again, if there are multiple tumors, it should add up to that total of 20 or 40 millimeters. Ethics of conducting research in humans is not applicable to this audience, but just for general knowledge, I thought I would include this slide. So there are guidelines even for humans. It began with the Nuremberg Code after World War II. And now we have the Declaration of Helsinki, and every country has their own guidelines. For us, it's the ICMR. Sorry. And yeah. Moving on to fabrication and falsification. Very, very crucial because many of us are guilty of doing this knowingly or unknowingly. So let's completely remove the knowingly part. So among papers retracted, about 1.7 are only because of fabrication of images. A lot of examples from Indian scientists. It is embarrassing. So I won't even go there. Let's understand the difference between fabrication and falsification. Sorry. Oops. My slides have moved. Just give me a couple of moments. Okay. So things to consider when you are altering figure. No, sorry. Before that was, what is fabrication and what is falsification? Fabrication is just making up data or results and recording or reporting them. Okay, out of thin air, you just churn out numbers, you just create a figure. Okay, falsification is when you manipulate. So you have some data, you have some figures, sorry, and you go about tweaking them. So that's the difference between fabrication and falsification. So now I'd like to point-wise list out what is acceptable and what is not. Number one rule, always keep your original unaltered file available, always. Because later on, maybe many years later, if someone questions your integrity, you will always have the original figure file. And that applies to even your data, your Excel sheets, your lab notes. Always keep the original. Discuss with your lab members what is acceptable and what is not. For example, you can adjust the brightness, balance, or contrast. You can do that, but only if you do that to the entire image and not just one particular section. So, for example, you're showing two panels. You can't adjust the brightness of one panel or one band and leave the other as is. It has to be done uniformly across the image. Fourth, all bands or features that are evident in the original image must still be visible. So you may increase or decrease the contrast, but don't try to make bands disappear. Again, all panels should have equal brightness and contrast. Don't remove the background fuzziness so that the background becomes white. You don't need to create a perfect, this is not an art competition, perfect white background. That is not needed. You know, in the absence of noise, actually people start suspecting there is something wrong. If you're working with gels and you need to splice lanes into another gel image, please indicate where the splicing has occurred. For example, with these white lines, I indicate that these are not part of the original gel. They have been spliced into this image. Back to Dr. Wusuk, he went on to even manipulate his images. He actually duplicated the image. So when the images were checked, they found that he had actually used the same image twice. Similarly, Dr. Obokata, she also spliced a lane into the gel without indicating where. And the other thing she did was duplication. So if you look, a very keen eye will be able to see that these two bands, she has not only duplicated them, but she has flipped them. She's inverted them. So, this is playing around with the image, and this is playing around with data, which is absolute no-no. So in summary, your original images are very important to the credibility of your work. Don't tamper with them, follow the guidelines, and don't introduce, remove, obscure, or move any feature. And if you are making any adjustments to your images, please disclose this in the legend or in the method section. So just a question, sometimes you don't have your lab notebook handy and you suddenly find an interesting finding. You quickly note it down on blotting paper or tissue paper. Is this considered misconduct? Sloppy lab notes, and is it misconduct? Yeah, it's not misconduct, actually. It's really not. It's not unethical, but if you don't keep your notes and things carefully, it could lead to issues later on. So Obokata and Wusuk later on claimed that some of the cell lines had been mislabeled because of carelessness. Whether that is true or not, we don't know. But leave no room for carelessness or any kind of So it is not misconduct, but it is something that you should be careful about and avoid doing. So if you have noted it down hurriedly on a blotting paper, be sure to enter it in your lab notebook later on. Authorship. So who is an author? And when we are very junior, when we are just starting out our research career, we are not really sure what an author is. We start thinking anybody who has offered help in the manuscript should be an author. No. So these are 4 criteria laid down by the ICMJE. Only someone who fulfills all 4 should be an author. And if you don't fulfill all 4, you need to be acknowledged in the acknowledgements. So an author is a person who contributes significantly to the conception, design, execution, and analysis and interpretation, participates in writing or revising the manuscript, approves of the version to be submitted, and agrees to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So again, to reiterate, one who doesn't meet all 4 criteria should be acknowledged. Also, before you even start writing the paper, it's a good idea to discuss openly who should be named authors and what should the author order be, so that later on there is no conflict. And I'd recommend that you visit the ICJME guidelines. Links to all these will be provided at the end, so please go through those resources. Salami slicing. So I saw a lot of questions being popping up about this. What is salami slicing and how is it unethical? Fragmenting the results of a single study and reporting them in multiple papers is what is salami slicing. It is considered unethical. To a researcher, it doesn't seem unethical. You think, oh, I'm going to increase the number of papers, my CV will become longer, and what is wrong? But if you think about it, those number of papers are not increasing the knowledge as such. It is just increasing the amount of literature, but the amount of knowledge remains the same. It's just a wastage of resources, yes, and time. So as long as the slices of a broken up study share the same, note this, hypothesis, same population, and same methods, this is not acceptable. It has to then be part of one study. So these are 2 examples. One is that you have completed a study about a new intervention related to animal births. You have 2 sets of data, one on the maternal data and one on the offspring. Should these be in 2 separate papers? Second, you have completed a study about the effects of a new antibiotic on cattle. And you have several sets of data. You have some 3-4 breeds of cattle. And you can easily, do you think it's a good idea to have, effect of antibiotic A on Jersey cattle, effect of antibiotic A on Holstein cattle? Is that a good idea or correct? It is not ethical because this is a clear-cut example of salami slicing. Your paper will have a greater chance of publication as a full-scale study. So focus on the quality rather than quantity of publications. Correct. Everybody got that right. I'm so glad. Plagiarism. This is a favorite topic. Students always want to ask about this. So I really hope I'm going to answer a lot of questions. Uh, you know, First I'm going to talk about the types of plagiarism. And there are different classifications really, actually. But more or less, it is just common sense. You are copying or using someone's data or words without citing them. Wholesale plagiarism is the most blatant, where the author borrows or steals material written by someone else and submits it as if it's their own. It's just stealing, actually. Mosaic plagiarism is where someone copies words or phrases, and it's actually okay if you want to quote someone, but then you need to put those in quotation marks. So if you don't do that, that's verbatim plagiarism. Now, conceptual and structural plagiarism, it's a bit of a gray area, but still I'll tell you about it. So you get your distinctive ideas from a different source, but you don't thank them or attribute them. Structural plagiarism would be the original approach to a problem you copy from someone else. Again, without thanking or attributing or citing the original source. Okay, another question. You come across a lengthy article on an interesting topic. It's in a different language. Maybe it's in Hindi, maybe it's in Chinese, and you know that language. You decide to distill the study in your own words, maybe even shorten it a little, and then you decide to submit it in English as your own. Is this correct? Thank you. Absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. And this is known as, it's a kind of disguised plagiarism. It is called translation plagiarism. So this is considered highly unethical. So what are the reasons for plagiarism? So a lot of us seem to be aware of what is right or wrong, but still we see so many cases. I follow a lot of these science integrity detectives on Twitter, and almost every day somebody is reporting some sort of case of plagiarism. And sorry to say, a lot of them are Indian scientists and Indian students. Either they are at Indian institutes or they are abroad. But I see those names and it's just really, really sad. So in many cultures, junior authors think that if they alter the words of senior authors, it is disrespectful. So that is why they want to use the same language. No, there is no such thing. That's wrong. A second reason is that if people who are not confident about their language feel that, rather than spoiling the sentence, let me just use the original language because, my English is not that great. No, there is no such thing. Because there are ways you can improve your language. You can get help, editing help. That is completely ethical. You can ask someone to help you proofread your manuscript or help you with the language. That's perfectly fine. And similarly, someone may not be confident about paraphrasing a very technical description. So let's talk about how we can avoid this. If you are unable to paraphrase or rephrase another person's work, or it is impossible to rephrase, or it's a definition and you actually need to use those exact words, then it's fine. Remember to just enclose that text in quotation marks and cite the source. If you do these two things, it's absolutely ethical. If you do paraphrase or summarize something in your own words, make sure you don't alter the meaning. Even if it's something that is considered common knowledge or scientific knowledge, still cite the source. And if all else fails, as I mentioned, use editing services or a friend who's fluent in English, ask them to help you. That is perfectly fine. And of the many stories I told you, there was plagiarism even in Obokata's papers, even in her thesis. She had plagiarized large chunks of text from the NIH website. I have come across stories where Indian researchers from reputed institutes have copied text from Wikipedia. So this is just really unacceptable. So first is to avoid plagiarism, absolutely. A lot of people ask me about what are the tools available for checking for plagiarism. So these are some: Authenticate, Plagiarism, Urkund. I've been told that the Ministry of HRD has provided this in a couple of institutions in India. Some of these are free, some of these may be paid. But I would like to say that if you have written your manuscript and you have not plagiarized, you don't even need to use these tools. These tools are actually for the journal editor or someone else who wants to run a check. But if you are confident that you have not committed plagiarism, you actually don't need to use these tools. At the same time, people often ask me that what is an acceptable level of plagiarism? Because when these do similarity checks, these tools will do a similarity check. It will throw up numbers like 15% overlap, 25% overlap. So roughly 15% is acceptable because, methodology and certain sections you can't avoid overlap. 15% is considered acceptable. Anything more than that, up to 25%, starts raising red flag. Yes, so somebody has said et al. And references, things like that get captured. So there are ways in which you interpret the report. So whoever is interpreting the report, if they can make out that, okay, we can excuse the et als and this and that, it can be overlooked. So don't get worried about that. It's, yes, you're saying that plagiarism check using ORCON is mandatory. Absolutely. So it depends on who is interpreting the report. As long as they know what is acceptable and what is not, you need not worry. It is bound to happen. It even catches the author names and affiliations and addresses. That is, it's bound to happen. This is a very important topic, and not much is known about it. Again, it's a gray area. Predatory journals. What are these? These are journals that capitalize on the pressure to publish. They ask for an upfront fee. And no, it's not about being open access. This is a completely different ball game. You will see they will promise a very quick peer review or no peer review. They'll have very, very diverse, multidisciplinary topics. The website will look very strange, lot of errors and typos. If you look for the publisher details, you will not even find a proper address. It will probably be a residential address or something. What are these? So suppose, consider the situation. You are trying hard to get your paper published and you're facing rejection and long wait during peer review. But then suddenly in your spam inbox, you see an email. Actually, many emails inviting you, please submit your journal, your paper to our journal. We promise you we will publish it in 3 days. What do? Correct, ignore it. Absolutely ignore these, because first of all, what is it doing in your spam folder? Delete the email. Yes, correct. So, I keep getting these emails. I just go to my spam folder occasionally, and this is a favorite. This International Journal for Creative Research Thought Process. It is just, you see the website and you see these various red flags. It is cluttered. It'll advertise its impact factor like anything. Lot of typographical errors. You click on the links and the links just don't open. So please avoid falling prey to this. It's better to wait. Have a look at what, well-known journals, what their websites look like. And, it's a complete giveaway. And there are also these lists that list out, there's the white list and the black list, which provides journals that are predatory and those that are not. And there is also an initiative known as the Think, Check, Submit initiative. You go through these pointers, and if any red flags are raised, you realize that, okay, I should stay away from this particular journal. So just remember, think, check, submit. Answer all these questions. If it's yes for most of them, then it's safe. And UGC CARE also has such a list. In fact, when UGC came up with this list, there was a fake UGC website that even popped up. So this is what the original UGC website looks like, and there was a fake one that even popped up. So these are very, very devious people, and they can even clone websites of known journals. So you need to be really, really aware. And I'll be talking about this later. You need to have open discussions in your lab with your lab mates and your advisor about these kind of issues. Because like a crime syndicate, they are always evolving ways to be ahead of the researcher and try to trick the researcher. So be on your toes and be very aware. In short, be careful when selecting your journal. Use known journal selection tools. Okay, you have these Scopus and Web of Science and several platforms where you can search for select journals. Avoid direct invitations to contribute to lesser known journals. Unless you're a very, very, very famous scientist, no one is going to approach you and ask you for, reviews are occasionally invited, but those are again for very senior researchers. And look out for these warning signs like a promise of quick review, poor looking website, and dead links. Now, fake conference is another addition. I don't think need to worry about this now, given the current scenario. In-face symposia and conferences are going to not happen for a very long time. But still, there are predatory conferences. You pay the registration fees and suddenly the website will disappear or they get cancelled. And it will feature eminent speakers, but if you contact those speakers, they are unaware. So be aware there is even this phenomenon of fake conferences. And like the Think, Check, Submit, there is a Think, Check, Attend initiative. You can go through the points over there. So, one will wonder, why do researchers behave unethically? Okay, predatory journal was not a researcher problem. That is something you need to be aware of. But all the other topics that I spoke about, why does this happen? One is the bad apple theory, like in crime. I mean, some people are just morally corrupt. They are predisposed to act a certain way, to cheat, to lie. In that case, I mean, other than punishing them, there's nothing that can be done. But there are other factors that lead researchers to do these things. There could be insecurity, poor mentoring, poor education about these topics, overambition. There could be unhealthy competition in the lab or in the field, isolation, feeling of dejection after your paper has got rejected. The problem is this publish or perish mentality. You think about why you decided to be a researcher. If you ask a young child who says, I want to be a scientist, and if you ask them why, they're not going to say, oh, because I want to publish 20 papers, 100 papers. No, they say they want to do that because they want to discover something. They want to make a difference to science or to society. So ask yourself, isn't that what you set out to do? So publishing papers, of course, it's very important for us for our career progression, but try not to fall prey to shortcuts. There is no room for that. And if you get caught, your career is anyway going to be affected. So it is very important. So in India, in the US, there is the ORI, Office of Research Integrity. In India, there is something called the Society for Scientific Values. So there are these bodies that oversee these kind of issues. It's very important to have periodic reviews of scientific records, assess workloads in the lab, ethics issues at all levels of education, starting from school. I mean, we are taught that cheating is wrong. And then later on, those students start copying to, write their SOPs for grant applications and things like that. So at every level, we need to be taught that it is wrong. There should be some sort of probably a reward system for people who reinforce good ethical conduct. And you as a researcher or a head of a lab or a PI, what could you do? Mentoring and discussing with your peers that it's wrong, and regular scientific audits at all levels. You have weekly or monthly lab meetings. You talk about your research progress. Try to incorporate this aspect also in your discussions. Do your bit to expose plagiarism and fraud. So you are in the system. You come across a paper or you come across maybe a colleague who's doing something unethical. Try and if that person doesn't admit it or something, report it to someone senior or to the authorities. And avoid treating it as a taboo. Discuss it openly. And very importantly, be aware and keep abreast of the latest news in publication ethics and research. At the end of this, I'm going to share a lot of links. I highly recommend that you go through them. It's very, very interesting. Every day there is a new story, and it's worthwhile understanding what really happens and why. So I'm going to end with this quote. The investigation into the Stap Cell scandal, they ended their report with this beautiful quote. Responsible and fair research is not measured by the impact factor of published papers, the amount of funding, or even Nobel Prizes, but the joy of unraveling the mysteries of nature and the mind to contribute to society. I know it sounds very ideal and all that, but you will say, but I'm a researcher. I need to move ahead in my career. But still, if all researchers could think this way, we could really, really stem this problem. So I believe you will be given a copy of the slides, so you'll be able to see all these links. A very good book. I'm currently reading the science fictions about fraud, bias, negligence, etc. And yes, that brings me to the end of the session. And I can take questions now.
Sunana, I've collated some questions for you. Can I start? Sure. I'll also
Please.
request Malti to stay online because there are a lot of questions which are overlapping. Yeah. So I'll start with you, Sunana. Using textbook titles as part of your article or review or presentation title, is it considered plagiarism?
Sorry, I didn't get the
Using
first part of
textbook
the question.
titles as part of your article or the review, is it considered plagiarism?
Using
Right.
textbook titles. Okay. First of all, why would you use a textbook title? I'm not sure. Are you, if you're quoting a chapter from a textbook, if I understand correctly, if you have quoted material from a textbook, as long as you cite it, it won't be considered plagiarism. But if you are not crediting that source, then it would be wrong. I really don't know what sort of textbook.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question. See.
Okay, maybe we can move to the next question, Sanana. Yeah. So,
Okay.
do you think using a site like Sci-Hub is the right thing to do? If not, what should be an alternative to access the journal articles?
Oh, there are plenty. Besides Sci-Hub, there is, as I said, there's PubMed, Web of Science, even Google Scholar. A lot of them you can access. And depending on the subscription policy of your university, a lot of them should be freely available. So try not to stick to only one database. There are multiple databases which you could source.
Sure.
And Google Scholar is also quite safe and very, very extensive. It covers almost all these databases.
Okay, thank you. Surena, someone asked, is it good to split your PhD work and publish it into 2 or 3 papers? Or is it a better idea to make it a single paper and then publish a big paper?
So that would again depend on the kind of study. So as I mentioned, suppose those papers involve the same population, the same hypothesis, and the same variable. Just a few different variables. Then that would be considered salami slicing. But if your paper addresses different objectives, there are 3 objectives of your thesis, for example. So then each could actually result in different papers. As long as it's not the same study approach and study population, and it's a completely different aspect, and there are, depending on the, I can't really think of an example right now, but it's very contextual. So just remember the hypothesis and population, if they are different, it should be fine as separate papers.
Could you emphasize on what leads to unethical practices? Is it the peer pressure grading system? This will help the students who have just entered into the world of research to understand the circumstances where one is prone to take these unethical steps.
Yes. So the most important reason is, of course, competition and pressure to perform. Some universities or maybe even UGC, I think, had this mandatory publication of 2 papers for PhD or MS, something like that. There are these certain minimum criteria that you need to fulfill. And which is why I agree this leads to some people wanting to commit to take a shortcut. But as I said, have open discussions, support your students, support your peers, and help each other as a team. And try to not let others succumb to this pressure. But it is very natural. It happens everywhere. So, but it's avoidable.
So Naina, can you explain about the meaning, importance, and credit of corresponding author and the first author?
Okay. So the first author usually is the person, they say that depending on the contribution, the first author is the most important author. But the first author need not be the corresponding author. Corresponding author is usually the senior most author. So there is a chance where the author who has contributed the most also happens to be the corresponding author. But say you're a junior author, it's your first paper or something, but you have done the most of the work. So you will be the first author, and maybe your PI would be the corresponding author. And in some cases, you might actually see some papers will actually say that we have listed the authors in alphabetical order and not according to contribution. So that is a call that the authors can take. Either the reader is to believe that it's in decreasing order of contribution, or if you want to specify otherwise, you can say authors with this A and B, they contributed equally, or there are these different ways you can categorize. So it doesn't have to be the same. The first author need not be the corresponding author. Corresponding author is the senior person, usually.
Okay, thank you. This question is for Malti. Someone asks, should the manuscript be written first and then modified according to the targeted journal, or should one prepare the manuscript with like a prior by keeping the journal in mind? What should be the approach?
A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. So obviously in terms of formatting, you're going to need to format from the ground up once you have already decided your target journal. But also depending on which journal you want to submit to, you might want to change the emphasis of your manuscript. So for example, if you're submitting primarily to an epidemiology journal, then you want to emphasize that aspect of your study. So then your introduction needs to change, your discussion needs to change, your conclusions probably will need to change. So then if you then change your mind and you say, oh, I don't want to submit to an epidemiology journal, I'm going to submit primarily to a veterinary science, general veterinary sciences journal, then you might want to have a slightly different emphasis. So in that way, you might need to rewrite some parts of your manuscript. But I don't think it makes sense to write the manuscript from the ground up anew for every journal that you submit to.
On that note, there is a subsequent question where someone asks that how do one select a journal? Which journal to target?
Sinana, you want to take this one?
Okay, I can try. So there are, for different publishers, actually, there are these tools. So if you go to the Springer website, there is a Springer journal selection tool. For Wiley, it's like that. What you could do is, depending on your subject, you just go into one of these tools like Springer or Elsevier and scan through the list of journals. Sometimes they'll provide an alphabetically arranged list. You could go by impact factor, by scope. It really depends on what you're looking for.
One thing I would suggest is maybe once you've finished sort of writing the meat of your article, largely what your discussion looks like, what your introduction looks like. Look at the journals that you cited, because those are the journals whose studies you are citing. That's probably the audience that's going to be most interested in your paper. So you can start from there. Like Sunena said, there are journal selection tools, there are journal selection services. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, so you can use those. But in terms of what factors you would consider, I think the first factor you consider should be, what do you want your audience to be? If you feel that the work that you're presenting is significant, it's something that should reach a wide audience, and you want to submit to a more broad-based journal. If you feel that the work you're presenting is more specialist, say for example, something about a new treatment modality or something about an interesting observation that you've made in the field, then you might want to submit to a journal with a more niche readership that would actually be interested and would be able to implement those findings quickly. So I think your first consideration should be your audience. Whom do you actually want to disseminate this information to? And once you made that decision, the impact factor decision, I think, depends on how significant you think the findings are, how novel the findings are. So the more significant or the more novel your findings are, the more likely it is that a high impact factor journal would be willing to consider your manuscript. So that's a fact. Obviously, you want to publish in a journal with a wide readership. You want the maximum number of people to read your paper. But you can't have an extremely niche or extremely specialized study and say, I'm going to go and get this published in Nature. It probably won't happen unless the result itself is very significant. So I think your first consideration should be your audience, the significance of your study. And then once you've made those decisions, I really think going down your own reference list will help a lot.
Thank you. Thank you both. So someone asks that please shed some light on the selection of keywords. Is it preferable to select keywords from the title of your manuscript?
No, not at all. So the philosophy when you're selecting keywords is what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize the possibility that your article will get picked up by indexing software. So the more the number of keywords you have, the number of keywords comes from your title, your abstract, and your keywords list itself. So the more number of words you have there, the more likely it is that your article will get picked up. So say if you have 3 keywords in your title, say you have, I don't know, mastitis, something in your title. And if you repeat mastitis in your keywords, usually there's a limit on how many keywords your journal will let you use. So if you use up one of those keywords that you're allowed on a word that is already in your title, then you're not maximizing the reach that your article has. So in order to maximize that reach, you want to have keywords that are unique from the words in your title. I hope that answers the question.
So the other question is, if you have done a novel type of work and you don't have enough references to support your work, what should be your strategy while reporting the research? You don't have enough number of references to report the study.
So I think what you would need to do in such a case is you would need to make a very strong case for the fact that the study is novel. But in order to make that strong case, I don't see how you would do that without an adequate number of references. If that makes sense, because in order to make the case that this is the first time this is being done, this is not something that has been explored previously, you can't just say that. You need to substantiate that claim with references.
Yeah. So Rena, this is for you. What steps should we take if we see someone indulging in misconduct?
Okay. So first, probably you can, if you are on talking terms with that person, you could talk to them about it and say, hey, you know what, I just attended this workshop and I think what you're doing is wrong. If that doesn't work, you should report it to someone senior of your institute. Try not to make a big noise about it. It's a very sensitive issue. So if talking to that person directly doesn't help, you either go to, if he or she is in the same lab, then you talk to the PI of your lab. If that doesn't work, you can talk to the head of the department. So, you go that way. So first, your immediate superior, you need to report it to them, and then they will take the necessary action. But it will be really good if you can be aware and report it.
Okay. The next question is how safe is it to use online plagiarism checker?
Honestly, I haven't used it, so I don't know. But I know there are a couple of students who have used it and have not had problems as such. It should be fine as long as they are well-known tools. Like I mentioned, Plagiarism. There is also something known as Viper, and these are free tools. They're like plugins or whatever. I've not heard of any issue as such, like no bugs or viruses associated so far. So it's absolutely fine.
I think most plagiarism check softwares will have some kind of a policy where they say that they don't store the data that they receive. So if you look for that, like if you use plagiarism check tools that actually say we do not store the data that is plugged into our software, that means that your articles are going to get stored and then misused later. So that's another thing you can look for.
Okay. Will submission of a pilot study of a research work be considered as salami slicing?
Pilot study of
your research work?
I don't think so. By definition, I mean, any idea? To me, it sounds fine.
Fine. There is also there's an increasing trend now in publication even to submit something called a pre-registration. So basically, before you've even started gathering your data, you publish the research plan as such, so that that's already on record that this is what we're going to do. So this is one way that authors use in order to not get scooped. Say, we have already put this research in place. So I think a pilot study should be acceptable along the same lines. I mean, I think as long as you acknowledge that it's a pilot study and that your discussion and conclusion say that further work is in progress and we plan to have more robust data. So I think it should be okay.
Okay. Do one need to check plagiarism while writing the materials and methods section, because you like there are timings when you have well-defined things there. So
correct.
Is plagiarism an issue?
Checking, doing the check will not really help you. As I said, the plagiarism check is more from the journal's end to ensure that there is no blatant case of plagiarism. And it is common for overlap to happen in the method section. It's highly technical, right? So as long as you have cited what methods you are using, from which studies, it's absolutely fine. There will be some level of overlap, and using a tool to check that and then get worried, it doesn't help anybody. It is a good journal will recognize that and allow it. But the main thing is that if you are using those terminologies or words or phrases, just make sure that you cite each and every relevant study. You don't have to use a plagiarism tool and try to minimize it. That is not needed.
Okay. Since we are talking about plagiarism, there is another question where someone asks that if you have, say, 15% plagiarism using a checker, and then those are majorly the renowned facts or someone else's work, and you have referred to their paper, how do you like escape from this situation, and how do you deal with this situation?
Okay, so as I mentioned, a sort of accepted level is considered to be 15%. That being said, if you have, say, 5 or 6 words in continuation that are identical to the source, or maybe a sentence or something, and you are unable to rephrase it, make sure you put it in quotation marks. Now, I don't know whether the plagiarism checker will consider it an overlap, but again, as I said, the journal editor will not consider it a case of plagiarism. As long as you're doing the things correctly, citing the source, enclosing exact verbatim text in quotation marks, it's fine. And anything else I can think of? Yeah, I mean, it is bound to happen. And with the increase in literature, this level of overlap is only going to increase. So sometimes I feel that the software might have to, change, or the way you interpret the report makes all the difference. The number is not what makes a difference. It's how you're looking at the report and what are the parts that highlighted colors. What are those parts? As someone said, et al will be highlighted, and certain strings of words. If you're using a particular abbreviation or terminology that appears multiple times, all those will increase that percentage. But do not worry, if the person assessing your manuscript is interpreting the report correctly, you have nothing to worry about.
Sure. Okay, someone asks if there is a good time limit, which is the gap between publishing your work, like acquiring the data and publishing. Is there a good time between that? So they say that if a research was done 2 years back, but they want to publish it now, is there a disadvantage associated to their work?
Well, if the work is no longer novel and somebody else has, beaten you to it and published those findings, then you are at a bit of a disadvantage, but there is nothing wrong. It will just totally depend on the level of novelty and what the journal considers novel. But a lot of people publish like a lot of old data. As long as it's adding something new, uh, there's no reason for you to, let that data go waste. You should try and get it published. But Malti, what do you think?
Like, for example, I know I was actually part of a study. I don't think I was in the author list, but essentially what they had done was it was a case series in a hospital. They collected data over about 3 years or something like that, and they never published it. But even 2 years after the data collection had ended, that was still the largest cohort that they had collected data for that particular disease in India. So it was still relevant data, and it still got published. So it depends on the data. If it's still useful, then I would say yes. If it's the kind of data where the elapse of 2 years actually makes the data less useful, then the journal themselves probably tell you, what, this is probably no longer useful anymore.
How many number of references are enough number of references?
Establish that XYZ protocol has not been applied in this particular animal population previously. How many references do you need to convince the reader that this has not been done? 3, 4, maybe you need 3 or 4. You probably don't need 10. So you need to make a judgment based on that. How many references do I need to cite to convince the reader of this point?
Do journals provide scope for publications of original hypotheses or predictions or perspectives where you really don't have any experimental data, but you're supporting your hypothesis with references and literature survey?
I mean, I think unless it's a very hot topic in research, or if it's very controversial, something like I don't know, something like stem cell research or something where there's a lot of research happening, or if the person who's actually writing the article is a very respected researcher in the field. I feel like these are the things that tend to get invited by journal editors rather than coming from the authors without invitation. Serena, what do you think?
Yes. There are some journals that have different. Sorry, my voice. Some journals have certain categories of publications, like perspectives and things like that. It would depend on the journal. So, hypothesis, I don't know, but yes, perspectives for sure. I have seen in certain journals in that type of articles, besides like case report, review article, original article, opinion, all that, it is there. But as Malti said, it's likely that a senior researcher would get invited to contribute like that.
Okay, thank you. So someone asked that in some journals, they see results and discussions as different sections, and in some journals, they are a combined section. So which should be the preferred approach?
For the first thing is, it depends on what the journal wants. Some journals will specify we do not want separate sections, we only want combined sections. Another journal might say we do not allow combined sections, the sections have to be separated. So that's your first consideration, what the journal is asking you for. Your second consideration is what is the best way to present the analysis of your data. So for example, if you have a lot of very complicated results and those results are very dependent on what was done in the field previously, you might want to have the result and its interpretation side by side. That might be a more effective presentation. Whereas on the other hand, if your results are very linear and your discussion is very general, then you might not have a discussion that corresponds exactly to each result, and you might have a general thesis to say about all the findings together as a whole. So then a separate section might make more sense. It depends on your data and it depends on what the journal wants.
So this is probably for Sunena. If we are writing a literature review and need to insert a table, is it ethical to take the data from someone else's paper, add our new and current findings to that, and publish it? Will they accept it, or will it be considered plagiarized?
So if you're using the exact same table, say as an image or something, that could be covered by copyright and that would be considered unethical. But if you are adding your own, you might have to you definitely cannot use the exact table that they have used. You create a separate table and add your information, and of course cite that original table. You could say that source is not source really, but you need to cite that original study while you cite that table. But as long as you're adding your information and not using that exact any published material as it is, if you're going to be using it and it's published, then that is a breach of copyright depending on what copyright covers that particular journal. But you are adding something to it and citing the source, then it's fine.
Sure. Can I still make changes or corrections to my article after it has been published online first?
So there is this system of what they call errata and corrigenda. So you'll have to contact the journal editor and they will take a call on how it needs to be done. If it's come online first and it's not yet been assigned into an issue, it should be fine. And even if it gets into an issue, corrections can be made depending on the level of correction. Sometimes author names are changed and all that. So it is done. It is, you contact the journal editor and it will appear as a corrigenda mode.
It's observed that some papers have a conclusion section and some do not. So is it necessary to include this section in the paper?
Journals ask that you have a separate section with the heading conclusion. But even if the journal does not ask that, I feel like the last paragraph that the reader reads should be a paragraph that basically sums up the study and performs the function of a conclusion. So if there is no separate conclusion section, then the last paragraph of the discussion should fulfill that function. But I don't think that's, I think that's an essential part of the article, because that is what really pulls everything together for the reader. So you don't want the reader to have to sit and make those interpretations on their own. That's part of your function as the author of the paper.
For someone who has no experience in scientific writing, could you suggest how they should start?
Start with the methods, start with the methods and the results, because that is what you know best, right? That's the meat of the work that you've been doing probably for the last 2 years. So finish that and then maybe sit back and think about, okay, how am I going to interpret these results? What do I know about what's been done in the field? And how do I explain to a reader how my work fits into that? So then once you've answered that question, then you can start writing an outline for your discussion. Say, okay, what are the arguments that I want to make in the discussion based on my findings? And then you should have a skeleton before you start writing your discussion. If you just plunge in, then the discussion just goes all over the place and then it's not coherent. So have an argument ready, have a skeleton ready, and then support that argument with citations. So then that's your discussion written. Then I think after that is when you would start writing your introduction, because that is when you want to make a case for why do we do the study in the first place. And I think one piece of advice I was given, which I find very useful, every paragraph that you write in your paper should be written with your study aim in mind. You shouldn't have any paragraphs in your paper that do not either directly or indirectly relate to your study aim. So I think if you write the paper like that, then you get a much more coherent document. And then once you've got all your discussion written, then you write your introduction. Once you have that, then you write your abstract, keeping only the most significant points in your abstract, based on the things that we talked about in my session. And then you write your title.
I just like to add here, sorry, again, it's my voice. It's very important to read. A lot of students especially say, how do I improve my writing? How do I become a better writer of manuscripts? It's very important not just to read papers related to your subject, because when you're going to be reading about that, you're focusing on the subject. Try to read articles on different subjects, popular science articles, scan abstracts, and you sort of get an idea on how good papers are written. So I cannot stress this enough. You really need to read a lot to be able to write better.
Can't hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Importance today.
It is still a measure of how extensive a journal's readership is. People are starting to become a little disillusioned with the impact factor system. They are starting to say, maybe we need to find a better way of understanding how much impact an article has, how much impact a journal has. But that's not really, there's not been any major change yet. So yes, a journal with a high impact factor is still going to have a certain amount of prestige associated with it because of the wideness of that journal's readership. Like, I don't see that a journal like Nature is going to stop being impressive. Like, if you have a publication in Nature, the kind of reach that article has. So the short answer is yes, but things are changing. People are sort of trying to find different ways of looking at it, different metrics to use. A lot of these high impact factor journals sort of work based on institutional subscriptions. So institutions that have the kind of money to subscribe to those journals. So people are saying maybe we need to have a metric that better represents how individual authors look for papers. So there are some changes, but right now impact factor does still have a certain amount of meaning, yes.
I have a few questions for Rahul. Rahul, can I request you to turn your camera on? Someone asks, thanks Rahul, is ethical approval compulsory for all journals?
For the standard journals, I guess this question is coming from a veterinary researcher's point of view. For the standard journals, yes, it is a mandatory requirement, and they seek for the approval that is common in that geography. For example, a certain set of requirement may be there which is specific for India, or if you're doing a research in Germany, that kind of, say, state of Bavaria license is there. So you need to provide that. I'm for sure Nature publication group definitely ask for it, and others also will do that. So it is a mandatory requirement, I would say.
Okay. Another question is, which animal model has the least ethical concerns in terms of getting the study to be approved by the ethical committee?
Well, I'm not sure. Is that the right question, or which animal model the research fits? That should be the question, actually. So I would say that the invertebrates and insects, they do not require ethical approval. For doing research in Drosophila, they do not require ethical approval. But then, rather than going that way, I think the first question, what the research question is, and what is the right model to fit their answer, and then conducting the experiment based on the approved guidelines. Say already previous speakers have mentioned about ARRIVE guidelines, and there are CPCACA guidelines, and there is this institutional ethics committee that sits and go through the proposal. I think that is the best way to go about, rather than selecting something that doesn't really do much good about your experiment. For example, if you want to do tumor research, probably granuloma research, I think as opposed to mice, maybe guinea pig would be a better model. But depending on your choice of experiment, that should be the thing. That kind of experiment cannot be, if it is a tumor generation kind of experiment, it cannot be done on a Drosophila model, right? So yeah, I hope I have answered the question.
Okay. Another question is that sometimes while doing animal experiments, we include some extra number of animals just to ensure that we do not lose significant number of animals. In case some animals die during the course of the experiment. At the end, if all the animals survive the experiment, what approach should we follow? Should I include all the animals or restrict myself to the statistical significant number of animals?
See, honesty is very important at this case. I understand you take 100 mice and use 20 for optimizing the experiment. That is perfectly legitimate to do. But to infer a statistical finding based on that 100 animal, then that would be probably unethical. Then you have to infer the finding based on the 80 animal that went on to the experiments. And it is always advisable to add that information in the material method section, or maybe an sort of supplementary information, what exactly was the number of animal initially used. And nowadays people ask for this power calculation, so G power or some softwares are used. It is always advisable to use that also. People, because I see from a grants advisor point of view, we ask for that. How did you arrive at that animal number calculation? Even if more animals were taken, we need that clarification. So yes, you can use as many animals as ethically approved, but it is always good to be honest about it. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rahul. Thank you, Sunena and Malti, for joining us today. It was a very informative session. I'm sure all our attendees have found answers to many of their questions.
Yukti, if I may ask, say something.
Sure, Rahul. Go ahead.
Yeah, just quick. I have seen a lot of questions about quality of English, how this will impact the publication quality. Is there any freely available resources? That is one question that comes very often. How to improve it? So it is a kind of important aspect, but then the service providers, they charge exorbitantly. That's the reality. So I would like to, from my experience, there is a site called Author Aid. So please look it up. And this is a online platform supported by government of UK. So this allows authors from middle income country to access services. It's like a voluntary services of people from researchers from English speaking countries who are native speaker to proofread their article. There could be other services as well, but I thought that this audience can improve their writing skills using this service. It's called Author Aid. We can share the link also, I think. Please look it up. There are forums where you can collaborate for getting these checks done through native speaker. That also improves. I know personally of people utilizing that kind of services, and people going on to build long-term collaborations through these services. So please use those. These are freely available, and it adds value to the eventual article that you write, or it builds a long-term scientific collaboration also. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Rahul. Thanks again, Sunena and Malti. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. Thank you so much.
thanks. So before we move to the next session, please allow me some time to briefly talk about India Alliance's funding opportunities. This is what our fellowship program looks like. It funds individual scientists, and PhD is a prerequisite to apply for any of our basic biomedical schemes. For clinical and public health research, an MD or MD PhD or any other equivalent degree is the basic requirement. We provide grants and fellowships to scientists at different stages of their careers, starting from early career fellowship for postdocs who plan to pursue a career in science and are looking for funding opportunities for an independent research position, to intermediate fellowships for scientists who plan to set up an independent research group. And then we also have senior fellowships for established researchers who plan to expand their research programs in India. Our next call for application will be launched next year. We also have other funding opportunities, grants like Team Science grants, clinical and public health centers, research management, institutional grants and fellowships. You can find all the details on our website, www.indiaalliance.org. A small announcement before we move to our last session. We will be issuing the e-certificates to all those who attend the entire workshop, but it might take us 5 to 7 days to issue these certificates, but you will receive your certificates. So with that, I would like to invite my